Hello, everyone. History, Winston Churchill said, will be kind to me, for I intend to write it myself. And he made sure he did, for he was one of the biggest mass murderers of the 20th century, and yet is the only one, unlike Hitler, Mao, or Stalin, to have escaped historical odium in the West. This is not going to be an easy topic, and I want you guys to be prepared for it. Today, I'm going to talk about one of the biggest Holocaust post-industrial revolution committed by the British Raj, or British rule, on the Indian subcontinent under the leadership of Prime Minister Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill during World War II. Widely considered as one of the most influential figures in 20th century, Churchill remains popular in the Western world as a strategist, war correspondent, author, artist, defending Europe's liberal democracy from the spread of fascism. And this is going to be an important point that we come back to. Amongst his less known accomplishments are the infamous World War II Bengali Auschwitz, the Indian Holocaust, or the Bengal Famine, wherein 6 to 7 million Indians were deliberately starved to death for no logical reason by Winston Churchill and the British Empire. To give a small example of their hatred, blatant racism, and perceived white supremacy against Indians is this. Signboards like these, dogs and Indians are not allowed, dehumanizing Indians, were a common occurrence outside establishments like schools, libraries, theaters, etc. under British India. Another sign of his disdain and extreme hostility towards Indians was his hatred for Gandhi. He wanted Gandhi to be laid down, strapped, trampled, and brutally crushed by a giant elephant with the British viceroy on its back. He called him a subversive fanatic, a half-naked fakir. He felt the same about almost all Indians. He called them beastly people with a beastly religion. To give some perspective, the Bengal province, as you can see, was much bigger at the time. It covered almost the entire northern and northeastern Indian subcontinent. And even today, hosts about half the Indian population. It had faced multiple famines before, some natural and some due to mismanagement. But the Churchill-caused famine took intentional apathy and bad policymaking to a whole new level. And because this region had faced famines earlier, it allowed imperial apologists to deny Churchill's contribution towards this atrocity until independent American and Indian researchers observed data and food ration and geological reports from the time and made the conclusion that this was the only one of all of those famines which received record-breaking rainfall at the time. So it had to be the reason for all of the atrocities had to be bad policy making. What also contributed to this was nearly half a century of massive deindustrialization, exorbitant taxation, banning of the local currency, unreasonable exchange rates, straight-away ban on exports, followed by systematic emptying of food and storage reserves. The equivalent of this today would be the British coming here and banning the USD and forcing everyone to buy only made in UK products. Excessive exploitative continuous farming made large areas of land fertile and infertile, and bad irrigation techniques caused further waterlogging only to make more breeding grounds for malaria at a time when medicinal healthcare was not only not affordable, it was also intentionally inaccessible. Now, starvation, malaria crisis, refugee crisis, population displacement, debt traps, human trafficking, prostitution, indentured servitude, slavery, suicides were just some of the attributes of the Bengali Holocaust. I want you guys to be prepared for what I'm going to show you now. That's the reason I have the sensitive content warning, because these images are extremely powerful, and I just wanted everyone to be prepared in case it gets gut-wrenching. Nearly the entire outputs of India's cloth, wool, leather, and silk industries were sold below cost or at unreasonably high taxes to the imperial military. By the end of 1942, cloth prices had more than tripled from the pre-war levels, and they had more than quadrupled by mid-1943. And much of the goods left over for civilian use were purchased by speculators and hoarders. This, combined with the unfortunate Japanese invasion of Burma or Myanmar today, resulted in a refugee influx of 500,000 people in the middle of the famine. And their arrival only increased demand for food, caused further shortage of clothes, medical aid, causing more panic in a region already in the brink of chaos and starvation. Those who could beg, begged, work, worked. Those who could steal, steal. Some simply trafficked themselves to survive. And vultures waiting for people to literally drop dead was an unfortunate but frequent visual in the streets of the Bengal province. Churchill's policies for rationing nearly all of India's textile for British military and allowing leftover textiles to be sold domestically at a markup of 400% caused something called as the cloth famine, something that I wasn't even aware of before I started research for this rap. This cloth famine, hundreds and thousands of people committed suicide because they didn't have fabric, enough money to even buy fabric to cover themselves when they go out. Women chose to stay inside all day and only went out if they could find other women with which they could share enough fabric to cover their parts of themselves, not in the entirety. This caused further unemployment, and some of the only things that people had in the end to do was sell themselves. And this caused a lot of human trafficking problems and created one of the most extensive human trafficking network, which still runs to the day. Hundreds and thousands of kids were orphaned. People sold their kids themselves for a mere few pounds of rice. I want everyone to just take a second and imagine. This was an entirely avoidable tragedy. And here's another reason why. Churchill's war cabinet shipping assignments made in August 1943, shortly after some British officials pled for famine relief, shows very clearly Australian wheat flour and other food resources traveling everywhere in the Imperial Empire, traveling in the Middle East, traveling to Ceylon, Southern Africa, everywhere via India, stopping at ports in India, but to India. The war cabinet ordered the bill of stockpile of wheat for feeding European civilians after the war and after those people had been liberated, and for an unlikely but possible invasion from Yugoslavia. So 170,000 tons of Australian wheat bypassed starving India, destined not for consumption, but for storage. The use of the word famine was also banned in media. And although political spectators observed that disproportionate amount of war stockpiling meant that someone somewhere was starving, Churchill made it his point to make sure that that somewhere was India, because he hated Indians and he believed that the famine was their own fault for breeding like rabbits. And I'm quoting him. Now, I know that these images are extremely graphic, but they are crucial to give a tiny glimpse into the pages of history that were unfortunately intentionally whitewashed. For the sheer magnitude of cognitive dissonance and disdainful duplicity exhibited by the so-called defenders of democracy against Nazi fascism was evident when these white supremacists were conducting some of the most inhumane war crimes themselves. And FYI, they gassed people too. Now, imposed poverty kills. In short, the Industrial Revolution and global dominance of Great Britain was sponsored by rapacious exploitation, plunder, massive deindustrialization, and a genocide that lasted 2 centuries, killing almost 1 billion Indians. At the beginning of the 18th century, the British economic historians documented India's share of the world economy was close to 23%, as large as the entire Europe's economy at the time put together. India supplied more than 1/4 of the world's gold, spices, and silk, the same spices and silk in search of which Christopher Columbus discovered a new route to Caribbean when he stopped at West Indies, thinking that was India. By the time the British had departed India, India's global GDP contribution had dropped to mere 3%. The British robbed India of nearly $45 trillion between the year 1765 and 1938. However, it is estimated that if India had remained free at the time, with the 24% of global GDP, it would have been about $230 trillion richer today. And forget the moon, we could have solved cancer and left for Andromeda. And the reason was simple. India was governed for the benefit of Britain. Britain's rise for 200 years was financed by merciless taxation, deindustrialization, and depredations in India. And some of the biggest global problems left today, the Iraq-Iran-Palestinian conflict, the India-Pakistan-Kashmir conflict, were also some of the final intentional problems left behind by the British. Churchill said that he had nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. He never said whose. Thank you.